Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first plenary of the 15th World Forestry Congress. Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, you have enjoyed today the grandiose opening of the Congress with the very high-level speakers. And we also have just launched the FAO's State of the World Forest 2020. The title of this session is The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, 8 more years to heal the planet. Why this title? Well, because we are now in the second year of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We have 8 years to go until 2030. And we want to build a real movement within the next 8 years we have left. And why do we want to talk about this topic? Well, land degradation that covers also forest degradation has affected over almost 2 billion hectares, and it has also affected more than 3 billion people. So it is an issue in this planet. And such degradation is unfortunately intensifying, and it has impact on climate change, and the climate change has impact heavily on the degradation. So no doubt we need to find the solutions, and we need to scale them up. And we need to do that ASAP. There's no time to lose. So here we are today to discuss specifically the restoration of forests and landscapes. So in this session we have 2 panels. And they are moderated by a renowned journalist whom many of you know already, and James, who is here behind me already. James, I would like to introduce to you James Astil. James is from The Economist. James is currently the chief of the Washington Bureau of The Economist, and he has previously left the South Asia Bureau. He has very international background. He has covered politics, but also natural resources matters basically around the world. And he's really an award-winning journalist. For example, he has won the Gresham Prize for writing on the environment. So James, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Tina. Very pleased to meet you all, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this double-headed session. As Tina said, I'm the Washington Bureau Chief of The Economist, also a former environment editor of The Economist, and I've been working on forests in some capacity or other at The Economist and outside The Economist for a dozen years now. And nothing in my journalistic career has been as fulfilling and also at the same time as terrifying as this work on forests. It's fulfilling because of quite how important forests are, something that I know you all need no lesson on. Their importance is measured in so many manifold ways: for biodiversity, for regulating the climate, for providing millions of livelihoods in some of the poorest countries, and so we could go on. And this work is at the same time terrifying because we are not winning our battle to protect forests. We're losing them at an extraordinarily rapid rate, despite the decades in which we have been talking of arresting that forest loss. Over those dozen years that I've been working on forests, we have lost well over 100 million hectares of forest land. We know that cannot continue. But can we stop it? Can we make our commitments to avert deforestation meaningful? Can we, at the same time, for we must, restore degraded landscapes, including forest land, on the massive scale that we have set ourselves to do under our Bonn commitment? I'm hoping that the excellent speakers and discussions that we have ahead of us this afternoon can shed just a little light on that critically important question. And with that, let me introduce our first distinguished speaker, Her Royal Highness Princess Basma bint Ali. Princess Basma is the founder and chairperson of the Royal Marine Conservation Society of Jordan, chair of the National Biodiversity Committee, member of the board of directors of the Princess Alia Foundation, and she's been recognized with a host of international honors for all of her great environmental work. Amongst those things, I might mention that Princess Basma is the first Arab woman to receive the title of Hero for the Planet from Time magazine. I'm excited to hear her remarks.
Can we have the, yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, how should the world look like after 10 years of global movement and action on the ground to restore degraded forests and lands? Well, this question was very hard to answer without having the fear of doubt set in. But I thought there is an opportunity to spark hope and optimism, inshallah. Can we go to the next slide? So I thought, well, really it's all about the unity of diversity. It's not just about the trees, and this is something I really want to push forward. Forests are not just trees, but rather the ecosystem, the landscape level, and everything it encompasses, including soil biodiversity. And I think this is something many people often miss, that the soils are really, truly the core and the foundation of a healthy, thriving ecosystem. But the majority of the global population don't understand that concept, and we have to, if in 10 years, we have to get that message across to them. So it becomes really a given, and we don't have to talk about it within 10 years, inshallah. Next slide, please. Now, leading into the following concepts are well understood and they've become internalized within society. We also have, can you press? Yes. Biodiversity is actually the concept that it's the larder of agriculture and the pharmaceutical industry. Can you press? And also that biodiversity and agriculture are both interdependent and they have to be sustained, but in a very dynamic balance. And then industry is no longer a source of habitat destruction as pollution as it is today. And with renewable energy is the main power source for our future, hopefully within the next 8 years. Next slide, please. Now this will take, there are 4 dimensions to this. We have the political support, and then the restoration interventions, and then monitoring assessments, and of course governance. If we go on. In terms of political support, to get green growth, there are 3 pillars that we have to base our system on, the green growth on, which is the economic and the social and of course the environment. And this is what it should, they all have to be prioritized in the same level, where you have resource efficiency and policy regulation reforms, and as well targeted funding. And targeted funding is one of the many, this is something that's come up in the opening session and in the earlier sessions today, where funding is really a driver of how things can come across in the next 5 years. Now, in terms of the high-level policy reforms, you can't do it alone. You have to have an open communication between local grassroots projects, and where you have the indigenous peoples, local communities, and of course, at the core of it are the women, if I may say so. And they are the ones that has to be open communication to see, because it's a dynamic process, the communication has to go back and forth to see how it's going to develop forward. Next slide. And this is something where we have to really look very in a scrutinizing way at how our agriculture production system are going to change. We have to have a paradigm shift between the factory-based production to more regenerative, holistic approach. And this is something that is, I know, not easy, but it is very doable. And if in 10 years we want to, or 8 years rather, at the end of the decade of restoration, we want to truly achieve this, we have to make this paradigm change where food industry adopts sustainable methods of production and ceases to be the major cause of habitat destruction. And I can't mention this without mentioning, can't go on without mentioning that food waste is a very, very important part of this dialogue, because at the core of all these discussions in the next few days is how do we sustainably manage our resources? Yes, that's one part, but we have to also look at the food waste. It's estimated that every year 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted. Even the Agenda 2030 target 12.3 calls for halving that per capita global food waste at both the retail and consumer levels, inshallah, by 2030. In general, food waste is more common in developed countries, 40% due to retail regulations and consumer inefficiency, whereas food loss is more common in developing countries due to the inefficient handling, processing, and storage of the products. So you have the two sides. But there is an opportunity to become more efficient to attain food security and achieve the SDGs goal number 2, zero hunger. Next slide. In terms of nutrition, in trying to achieve that, we need to also consider that it's not merely just the supply of food, but rather the nutritional value of food. It is estimated by the Crop Trust that 2 billion people are malnourished. The issue is not just limited to the access to food, but also the nutritional quality, as I said earlier, of the produce. And the cornerstone of this is the biodiversity that lies within the soils. When you have healthier soils, you have healthier crops, which you get a healthier, more value nutrition produce. Now, if we go to the restoration interventions, it is important to note here that projects are process-driven, they're output-oriented, they're dynamic. So as time goes by, their priorities will often change because it is an adaptive process. And also we need to promote that the right plant for the right place. And using traditional knowledge, and I always go back to traditional knowledge because indigenous peoples, local communities have been living with nature in a very harmonious way. And it's only when we became industrialized that this relationship has changed. But we have a lot to learn from them. And one such example is the Hema system, where we have in our traditional pastoral system, where we bridge the past knowledge of the Hema, which is managing the rangelands, with today's pastoral habits to produce a rangeland rehabilitation program that has shown and proven to increase biodiversity by 30%, as well as biomass. And it's proven to be very, very successful. And I would truly try to encourage everyone to do the same. And the other aspect which I haven't heard today, but I would like to bring up, which is the climate refugees. If we don't do anything now, we will have an influx not only of political refugees, but climate refugees, because many places in the world will become inhospitable, especially in terms of water. And this is something that I talk from true experience in Jordan. We are the second most water poor country in the world. And our water resources have become less and less every single year, and it's something I really do not want to see happen to us. But this is not one way to do things. There's not one way to do things. What may work in one place may not do so in another, but what is important is to monitor and to assess it. And this is where the relationship with technology and the scientists help us to assess, are we doing what's right? Is it working? How can we change? And we have to open this dialogue between each other to learn from one country to the other. So it's a cross-border issue as well, if we really want to work as a collective whole. The next slide, please. Also governance and the participatory approach. We have to engage, as I said earlier, the indigenous people and local communities and women at the core. And to do that, we really need to communicate. I always say we have to listen, listen, listen. Not come in with the attitude, well, we are the experts and we know what's right and how to do things. Very often, they know what works best. They know, they have that, the ancestral experience, and they know these ecosystems. I would like to share with you a small story of, there's this one Bedouin, very, very reputable person in Jordan who, by just holding the soil and touching it and feeling it, he knows how he can get me from the north of Jordan to the south of Jordan without running into a rainstorm if there was one, just by the temperature and the humidity in the soil. So that is something that no technology can match with that experience. We have to bridge the two together to forge forward for the future. Going back to the original point of the presentation about the future, how would it look like? So here I'm sharing this map. It's from the World Resource Institute, and it shows us a world of opportunity. We have many opportunities to reforest, but I would like to take your attention to, if you look at Brazil, and where all the red dots, where the recent tropical deforestation happened here. This may look alarming at maps, but the reason I chose this is because sometimes it can be deceiving. We have to be very, very critical of how we read the data we receive. We need ground truthing. We need to scrutinize the information data coming in so as not to manipulate it to our own agendas. And from here, I would like to introduce to you a project that is happening in Brazil by the Black Jaguar Foundation. And it's the longest biodiversity corridor in the very same areas where you saw the deforested areas. And this, I thought to use it because it can show us what is possible, what can be in the next 10 years or 8 years. It's around 262 million tons of carbon will be captured in a 2,600 kilometer long biodiversity corridor, which is 40 kilometers wide and over 10 million hectares. And it's $17.1 billion, it's estimated, will be saved in costs for the planet, and 38,000 jobs will be created in restoration economy just for that, and 2.7 billion will be generated in revenue for farming. But instead of me talking about it, I would like to share with you a video that they've produced that can better illustrate how innovative approach they have taken. So if we can put that up now, thank you. It's not showing. next slide, please. Thank you. Can you put the next slide? Yes. So I would like to say, maybe some people ask, well, why is the princess from Jordan promoting a project, the Black Jaguar Foundation project, all the way in Brazil? The answer to that would be because I am a citizen of the globe. We are all in this together. What happens in one area of the earth will affect another area. And as we have seen with the pandemic, this is very, very clear. We have to all work together as one hand and support each other, learn from each other, and hopefully give the gift of our children a bright future. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much indeed, Princess Basma, for those terrific remarks. We're now going to move into a panel discussion of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And to help us do that, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Maria Elena Semedo, who's the Deputy Director of FAO, and also a distinguished economist and politician from Cape Verde. Hello there, and welcome, Maria Elena. And to her left, Luc Nakacha, equally eminent, expert in sustainable development, environmental policy, and scientist from Benin, where he was also a government minister. And Luc is the chair of the Science Task Force of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Welcome, Luc. Maria Elena, just to sort of give us a broader sense of context and understanding, what is the UN Decade about? What is its potential and what has been achieved thus far?
On.
I think it's on.
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, James, and good afternoon to all. I believe after what the Princess Basma Ali has explained, you could see the importance of restoration. But what and why this UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration? Our leaders in 2015, they approved the Sustainable Development Agenda with 17 goals. And we have a goal, the goal 15, Life on Earth, which has a target. It's the target 15.3 on halt and reverse land degradation. FAO and UNEP together thought about how to contribute to reach this target on this goal. And we agree that we can, as Tina has said, we have now 2 billion hectares of land degraded. How we can contribute? And we agree that we can together have a goal to restore 350 million of degraded land. This is the goal we want to achieve in this decade. Now, although FAO and UNEP, we are the co-leaders of the decade is a movement where everyone is called to contribute. And as the Princess said, no one alone can achieve this goal. We have to be all together. We talk about the government, civil society, indigenous people, the private sector in this movement to achieve this goal. Now, this is what we aim, okay? And the aim is, if you want to achieve 350 million, what we need to do? We need to move at scale. We cannot continue to do business as usual. We need to transform our agri-food system. It has been said that we cannot see forest alone. We have to see forest in a systemic way in his interaction with agriculture, with biodiversity, so on and so forth. We need really to have an integrated and systemic approach. And what we need to do, if we create and we transform our agri-food system, we can eradicate poverty, we can reduce hunger and malnutrition. It has been said that restoration is not only plant tree, it's to create our soils in a way that it can become fertile and we can produce. And what the princess says for the soils, the need of to having healthy soils, I'm not going to repeat. If we restore, meaning that we can eradicate poverty, we can eradicate hunger and malnutrition, we can create jobs, we can transform our landscape and seascapes. We are not talking about only land, we are also talking about our seascapes and how they can be restored and how we can repair damaged ecosystem. Now, let me go to some points why and what could be the benefits of restoring our ecosystem. If we restore our ecosystems, we can increase food production. As I said, we can have more food, more feed, more fiber, and increase the livelihoods. If you go to economic benefits, as I told you, the aim to restore 350 million hectares, we can have a net benefit of 9 trillion US dollars, meaning that for each dollar invested, we have a benefit 30 times more, meaning that it makes economic sense. If we go to employment, we can create millions of green jobs. Let me just give you an example what we have with the Great Green Wall Initiative. Restoring 4 million hectares of degraded land in the Sahara and Sahel region, we have already created 300,000 jobs. Restore 4 million hectares, we create 300,000 jobs, meaning that in terms of production, in terms of economics, in terms of job employment, and regarding climate action, it has already been said, we can mitigate and we can adapt at the same time. And we can be removing around 1.5 gigatons of CO2 emissions each year, meaning that restoration supports adaptation, mitigation, and resilience of livelihoods and production systems. This to tell you how it pays back if we restore. Maybe we can move to the solutions if you consider, or we can talk about later on.
Let's bring Luc in, because I'd like him to give us another important piece of context here. And thank you for those words on the potential benefits, Maria Elena, which are, of course, very persuasive. Luc, those are the benefits, but we're not getting there, are we? What's been our history? Why do we have so much degraded land? Why have we been so unable to solve this problem hitherto?
Well, because we are far away from the paradigm shift Princess Basma has really highlighted. We need to bear in mind that up to 80% of forest loss is due to agricultural land expansion. I come from Benin. In Benin, the number is 98% of forest loss in Benin during the period of 2000-2010 is 98% is due to agricultural land expansion. So we must make sure that we halt agricultural land expansion on natural forest. We must do that during this 3 years window that we have for climate action. We have 8 years to heal the planet. We have 3 years, only 3 years remaining if we want to have a chance to keep the planet below 1.5 degree scenario. So that's how important it is. So one of the reasons why we think that we haven't been successful so far, or that restoration initiative has not delivered to expectation, is first and foremost because most of the initiative has not been designed to be socio-ecological system restoration. It has been mainly top-down we have lost sight from the socio aspect of the socio-ecological restoration system. The second aspect that the Science Task Force has raised as part of the reason why we haven't delivered is the lack of attention to near-term livelihood needs. If you want to restore and you do not make sure that restoration investment also delivers low-hanging fruit for local communities, you are not counting them in, actually. You are discounting them. And we have also given limited attention to trade-off. So restoration is not a silver bullet. It is a human endeavor. So there are trade-offs, and we must consider how we transform trade-offs into synergies, or at least we mitigate them. That's another aspect. And we have had limited engagement of planners and decision makers at the onset of it. So it has been like project, and that is why we highlighted that the main challenge of the UN decade is to mainstream ecosystem restoration into broader global and national sustainable development agenda. Unless it is there, we will still meet in 6 years for the next Forest Congress and still be saying the same thing. And the science has been poor into, we have actually done a poor job in putting science into it. And what do we mean by science here? We mean by science the very relevant, locally relevant knowledge. I mean knowledge including traditional knowledge that is relevant for the understanding of why degradation is ongoing and what can be done to reverse it. Sometimes you have discounted traditional knowledge, while if we want to really succeed into restoration that will deliver not only economic and social results, but also benefit, cultural benefits, even spiritual benefits, we must consider we must consider local knowledge and wisdom. And there's a scarcity of institutions that are focused on sustaining restoration effort over the long period. Restoration takes time to deliver. It takes time. And we lack institutions that will be working on it and ensuring that the benefits are sustained and the effort are sustained. And lastly is, we have 6 reasons what we have actually came up with during our work in the Science Task Force. Development projects to improve agriculture, enhance water resources, or exploit timber or mineral has often lacked awareness of ecosystem benefit, and they ended up degraded.
Thank you very much, Luke. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Princess Basma and Maria Elena have both given us, I think, some sense of the enormity of the potential benefits that we will get from ecosystem restoration. Luke has described for us why we have failed. And so often the failure has been based upon not dealing with the people who are closest to the ground, the closest to both the degradation and the potential restoration. Maria Elena, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about what FAO is concretely doing to address that historic failure. What is the UN decade all about? What's the process? What are the mechanisms for progress?
Yes. What we have done so far, we have already restored 106,000 hectares. It's not much, but it's showing that we are moving towards this decade, when United Nations decade on ecosystem restoration. FAO and UNEP as the lead, we advocate and we show to the leaders, to the communities, how important is to restore land and how it pays back. And we also offer solutions, win-win solution. As the princess has rightly said, we don't have one solution. The solution needs to be contextualized. And we, FAO has office around the world. We work around the world. We can facilitate, create this platform of exchange of experience, bringing what has worked in one context to another, always keeping in mind that it's not just to replicate, but to adapt to the reality. We also, how can I say, we bring solutions that are integrated. Luke has said that deforestation, one of the drivers of deforestation is agriculture. Indeed, it is agriculture. But what is the solution? How we can have agroforestry? How we can bring other ways that we don't do only agriculture, but we do agriculture with forest, with civiculture, with other landscape, as it has been also mentioned by the Princess. We in FAO, we also have the collaborative partnership on forest. We join force with them. The collaborative partnership on forest is not only the UN, we have representatives from different sectors, and together we promote the importance of turning the tide of deforestation. And we try to work with the donors and the partners to scale up investment. It has been said that we need resources. Through the Global Environment Facility, Jeff, you have already financed some projects. Through the Green Climate Fund. And also at the bilateral level, when we show the importance of restoration, we are trying to mobilize resources. And we have a big campaign on communication. Communication, it's important to create awareness on the importance of restoration, to bring all the partners together, because it's a movement. We have a movement, we call it Generation Restoration. How we can bring this hashtag Generation Restoration together to achieve the goal we have. But on top of what I said, we have to monitor progress. It's not to say we are aimed to reach. We have a system where we can see the progress, the gaps, and we can every time reverse if something is not going as planned.
But the main agents of this change will be national governments or development agencies or indeed the private sector? And are you working across that ecosystem?
We can say that we are the facilitators, but is a global movement. We cannot have only one side. We need to have the governments. We need to have the local communities. And when I say local communities, we have the pastoralists, the indigenous people, the foresters, the farmers, the ones working on aquaculture, the fishers. They have to be all together. And we have also the financial institutions. Because if you want to move at scale, to transform, we need to have the consequent investment and financial resources we need. And this is why I think we cannot do it alone. We have other partners, IUCN, we have UNDP at the UN level. All the governments should be with us. We need, as it has been said, to bring innovation, technology. And when I say innovation, it's not only what you say, technology. Innovation is also local knowledge. We use local knowledge for us in FAO and what we call it innovation. And to use all the solutions we have and to bring them to the table to achieve the goal we have defined together.
Thank you very much for that, Maria Elena. But Princess Basma, both you and Maria Elena have spoken about the importance of local people and their knowledge and the importance of listening was something that you stressed. How, can you just give us a few more thoughts on how you communicate with these local communities and what do they know and what don't they know? How can you improve their knowledge and what are the sort of means to reach out to them, if you like?
Thank you. Well, first off, they know much more than we do in the environments that they're living in. And what we can do is to use their experience, but we can also give them food sovereignty. And this is something I'm very passionate about because as more westernization and industrial development happened, we have lost our food sovereignty. Most of these local communities in the past were able to subsist within the local environment they're in, most notably in forests. And they've lost that in their illusion, or our illusion of trying to modernize. We've lost that sense. So this is something we need to go back to. And I keep on saying we have to listen, 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 because very often we don't know what they're experiencing. We don't have that experience. They know it much more. So we come in with our fancy schmancy, sorry to say this, solutions, and assuming that we know what they're going through, whereas they can better tell us. And this is something I speak out of experience. When I established the Royal Botanic Garden in Jordan, we had a plot of land which is given to the government, and it used to be used as a rangeland for the local communities who they grazed their sheep over there. And we wanted to fence it off and close it up to see the soiled seed bank when it comes, because we're all about native species in the Botanic Garden. And we gave them supplementary fodder for the biomass that they lost as grazing areas. And we developed the CBRR, which is the Community-Based Rangeland Rehabilitation, or now Restoration Program. And from that study, we learned so much from them that just by, not, as you mentioned, not fancy technology, but just by a proper management of the herd, biomass was increased, diversity of the plant cover increased by 30%. So this is what I mean when we listen to them, because they taught us that and it's a mutual transfer of information. But the most important thing is to win their trust, that they should be trusting of us, that our hidden agenda is none other than just to restore and better livelihoods, to have better livelihoods, because they've had bad experiences in the past, and I say of government and of policies that don't integrate them in the planning process of any project. And sorry, maybe I took too long in the answer, no. But yes, so this is what I think.
Thank you very much for that, Prince. We must all guard against fancy schmancy solutions when local knowledge is often the better way. Luke, let me ask you to give us a final word on that, because I know it's something that you feel strongly about. You're a scientist. You're deep in the science of ecosystem restoration, but you're also respectful of local knowledge. What do local people, and we're of course generalizing hugely here, but what do local people know, and what are the gaps that science can perhaps fill in?
Well, thank you, James. I'm rather someone who has really worked in translating science into policy and into action. And what local people, what they do know is their challenges. Actually, when we go to the field, I ask scientists, please, first, don't speak, but rather listen and open your eyes to understand why people are doing what they are doing, the way they are doing it, because they are not stupid. Sometimes what they know, they are not implementing it because the overall system is not rewarding that. So unless we, for instance, in Niger, we have heard about the assisted natural regeneration in Niger that has helped in 2 decades to restore more than 6 million hectares of heavily degraded land. In fact, the understanding is that wherever you see a degraded land in Niger or in the Sahel, actually, beneath the surface, you still have what they call underground forest. In fact, it is underground roots. And when it rains, the storm comes easily. And if you protect it, you can really help grow a new forest. The population knows that, but to help grow a new forest, you must prune them. But if you put in place a law that forbids the pruning, actually you are not helping what they can do to easily grow forest. So we must make sure that the overall policy system, including regulation and law, are really fit for helping local population to do what they can do best. Another thing that has helped the spreading of what has been finally labeled as farmer-managed natural regeneration in the Sahel, from the Sahel all the way to Ethiopia and to Tigray, is precisely farmers speaking to farmers. Those who have been successful are much more trusted than you and I when they speak to other farmers. So those schemes of communications they have helped in scaling up. So if we want to scale up, we must also take on board, including in communication, those who are doing what works.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a fourth ghost member of this panel, Angela Coleman, who's the Associate Chief of the Forest Service in the USA. That's the Department of Agriculture's Forest Service. And I think Angela has a message beamed over for us digitally. Could I ask you please to play that message?
Hello. It's a privilege to speak with you today on the topic of restoration. My thanks go to the World Forestry Congress, FAO, and UNEP for organizing this event. The mission of the United States Forest Service is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. The challenges we face today include climate change, catastrophic wildfire, and the epidemics of insect and diseases. These challenges transcend boundaries and affect people beyond the jurisdiction of any single organization. We are more interconnected and interdependent than we've ever been before. So tackling these challenges requires us to work together to find new ways of doing business at a greater pace, at a greater scale. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration shows the growing recognition by governments of the need to conserve and restore forests for human and environmental health and well-being, as well as for climate and economic resilience. President Biden's order tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad laid out a vision for contributing to global restoration and conservation in the United States. The United States has committed to conserve at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. This commitment, called the America the Beautiful Initiative, will help strengthen our economy, advance environmental justice, and tackle our interconnected climate and biodiversity crises. This is the first ever national goal for the stewardship of nature in America. The 30% goal reflects the need for conservation and restoration through voluntary stewardship on private lands and through visionary leadership by state governments and tribal nations. The work builds on a history of restoration on federal lands. President Biden's executive order, Strengthen America's Forests, Boost Wildfire Resilience, and Combat Global Deforestation, focuses in part on restoring ecological integrity across 310 million hectares of forests in the United States. Forests across the United States have been degraded by the effects of a changing climate, invasive species, and past land management practices. Partly as a result, we now face a wildfire crisis in the western part of the United States. In response, we have launched a national 10-year strategy to restore healthy, resilient, fire-adapted forests across high-priority landscapes at the actual scale of the wildfire risk. We have also launched a national campaign to reforest millions of hectares of federal lands deforested by catastrophic wildfires, timber harvests, and epidemics of insects and diseases. In 2012, the United States made a bond challenge pledge to place 15 million hectares of forests under restoration by 2020. It was an ambitious goal. But through partnerships with other governmental agencies, states, tribes, NGOs, and private landowners, we exceeded that goal. To date, we have placed over 20 million hectares under restoration. Meeting the bond challenge taught us valuable lessons. One is the need to work at larger scales, larger spatial scales, with partners across the shared landscapes. Our wildfire crisis strategy builds on that insight. Under our strategy, we will work through partnerships to treat 20 million hectares across shared landscapes at scale. Another lesson from the bond challenge is that partnerships and collaboration are critically important. By bringing together diverse perspectives, we build public support for restoration while also ensuring that social, economic, and ecological needs are met. Tens of millions of citizens in the United States live in thousands of communities that depend on healthy, resilient forests for their social and economic well-being. These lands are where they live, where they work and play, and the United States is committed to engaging them in the stewardship of shared landscapes, both for their own benefit and for the benefit of generations to come. We also need to continuously learn from one another, and that includes learning from our global partners. We are excited to have the opportunity at this World Forestry Congress to share knowledge and experiences, and of course, to learn from all of you. We're glad to be here.
Thank you to Angela Coleman. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our three excellent panelists and our speaker, Princess Basma, Maria Elena Semedo, and Luke Nakacha. Thank you all. And could I ask our next panelist to please come up? Thank you all very much. Okay, we're running a little late, so let's try to keep things moving. We're entering into a second phase of consideration of the same theme, the same problem, the same action. And the title of this second section, therefore, panel 2, is Action to Scale Up Restoration on the Ground. What are the latest knowledge, new approaches and innovations to scale up forest and landscape restoration? What I hope is that we're just going to get a little bit more concrete on some of the actions and problems that we discussed in the first part of that panel. And to help us do that, I'm very glad to be able to introduce to you Christophe Bessassier, who is the team leader of Forest and Landscape Restoration and the lead of the UN Decade Best Practice Task Force at FAO. To his left, Remy D'Annunzio, who is the REDD+ National Forest Monitoring Coordinator for Africa at FAO. And to the left of Remy, Ugratna Shrivastava, who's the lead of the Youth Task Force, Ugratna, at the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and the Youth Constituency focal point to UNEP. And to the left of Ugratna, we have Gabrielle Labate, who's the head of climate mitigation of the Climate Mitigation Unit and REDD+ Global Team Leader at UNEP. Very, very glad to have them address these questions for us. But before they do so, we have another ghost member of our panel, and that's Adriana Vidal, who is unable to be with us, but is here digitally. Adriana is the chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration and a senior forest policy officer at IUCN. If we could have Adriana's message now, please.
Thank you, James. Hello to everybody. I am truly sorry I can't be there in person for this session, and I hope I can join you soon in Seoul. Regarding this question, let me share some thoughts about what do we mean when we say partnerships in the decade. It really represents the spirit of the decade, bringing a wide range of stakeholders across sectors, expertise, and levels. However they are established, partnerships need to keep in mind some key things. First, they need to be inclusive of all the stakeholders at the scale they operate. They need to be gender responsive and geographically representative, if applicable. They need to be designed towards solutions and actions. That means that partnerships should be geared towards joint action for scaling up restoration successes and to address bottlenecks in knowledge, infrastructure, finance, resources, and capacity development. An evident benefit of working in partnerships is to create cross-learning dialogue and facilitate collaboration translated in enhanced actions on the ground. For instance, the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration, or GPFLR, which was created in 2003, and now with 35 members, such as international organizations, global reaching institutions, and national governments, aim to catalyze dynamic, voluntary action by sharing diverse experiences on restoration efforts that deliver tangible benefits to both local communities and nature through a landscape approach. Together, many of the members of the GPFLR have been operating in the last years to provide all the expertise and resources to support a global restoration movement, rallying towards the achievement of the Bond Challenge, which is a global goal of bringing under restoration 350 million hectares by 2030. The Bond Challenge, by the way, is a key pillar for the rising and adoption of the decade on ecosystem restoration. One key thing that we learned is that creating a partnership, platform, or other sort of network is not the end goal. The end goal are the results that these partnerships are going to obtain. Partnerships need to bring systemic change and disrupt the status quo for the better. It all starts with a vision that needs to be followed through with action plans to be implemented systematically and in the long term. I would like to share the example of a partnership called the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact, or PACTO, created to restore a key ecoregion in Brazil. Launched in 2009, PACTO mobilized over 250 partners with the goal of restoring 15 million hectares by 2050. The success of this partnership lies in several of the things that I mentioned before, which is having a common vision and goals that responds to the local context and motivations, the inclusiveness and organization of all of the stakeholders that have a role to play towards restoration, from landowners, students, local entrepreneurs, companies, investors, and the government. Also, the creation of knowledge and evidence that fundamentally supported decisions in terms of prioritization of restoration activities and the efforts to build an adequate policy environment that incentivizes large-scale restoration. PACTO reported areas under restoration over 1 million hectares, or 1 million hectares under restoration a couple of years ago, which speaks volumes of the efforts done by many partners throughout the years. If you are interested in learning more from PACTO, you are more than welcome. There is a lot of literature behind it, but I think it's a great example of what partnerships can achieve. And I hope that this gives you a glimpse of what can be achieved and motivate you to connect and collaborate with others at any scale of work that you operate in. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. For sure, partnerships across all of the many stakeholders involved in this effort are essential. But Christoph, I'm still struggling here. The ambition is so enormous. The past progress has been so dispiriting. If we really have 8 years to heal the planet, what do we know about the shortfall in both knowledge and capacity today?
Thank you, James. One of the key barriers identified to achieve the vision of the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration is insufficient technical knowledge and the lack of capacity to effectively design, implement, and monitor restoration at scale. It is why to address this barrier, that a UN Decade task force on best practices has been established in 2020. And last year, this task force implemented a capacity need assessment to identify major knowledge gaps through stakeholder groups that are engaged in several initiatives. Restoration initiatives. Those stakeholder groups all mention the following key knowledge gaps. I will not present all the results of this report. It is available online on the UN Decade website. But I will just mention 4 or 5 knowledge gaps identified in the context of this capacity need assessment. First, all stakeholder groups are mentioning the lack of intersectoral dialogue and the lack of capacity and coordination between stakeholders, both at national and landscape scale. They are highlighting as well the fact that there is a lack of capacity in terms of resource mobilization, both from the public and the private sector, and particularly for the financing instruments such as the Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, or even the Green Environment Facility. Several stakeholder groups mention the lack of capacity in terms of development of policies, strategies, or national action plans to support large-scale restoration program at national level. And few of them are as well mentioning the lack of capacity in terms of development of bankable restoration businesses based on sustainable value chains. Finally, the academic and finance group of stakeholders highlighted the fact that there is still a lack of knowledge on cost and benefits of ecosystem restoration that is key to mobilize investors. So we need to improve this. Building on this capacity knowledge and this capacity need assessment, the task force is currently preparing a knowledge and learning action plan to support restoration practitioners in the development of new knowledge product and to build the capacity during the decade. I would like to mention an example of an initiative that is already supported several countries to fill the gaps identified. This initiative is the Restoration Initiative. It is an initiative funded by the Global Environment Facility. And in this context, FAO, IUCN, and UNEP, we are supporting together 10 Asian and African countries to implement large-scale restoration program in the context of the Bond Challenge. There is a strong component on capacity development in this initiative, in the Restoration Initiative, and I would like to mention 3 main packages of activities to build capacity. First, we are trying to develop policies and to integrate better the policies to enhance enable environment for forest landscape restoration at national level. There is a work package really focused on resource mobilization, additional resource mobilization, with an approach to building on the support of project promoters in the context of the restoration factory. The restoration factory is a concept developed with UNEP Finance to help restoration practitioners to move or to transform their project idea into a bankable business. And finally, this restoration initiative is already collected good practices, success stories, and we are trying to disseminate those knowledge product in the context of the initiative between the 10 countries. So I think that this restoration initiative is an interesting laboratory for the UN decade. Thank you.
An interesting laboratory, maybe not one that we should feel too complacent about. If there's a lack of money, lack of institutional organization, lack of awareness, lack of supportive policy, I think that covers the lacks. There's a lot of them. Christophe, thank you. Remy, if we're not making progress, or if we are making progress, we need to understand that. So can you tell us a little bit about how we monitor developments on ecosystem restoration or worsening degradation, if you like?
Thanks, James. Yeah, good question. So monitoring is indeed an essential component. And as speakers were talking earlier today, I was thinking maybe we haven't emphasized enough on the fact that the monitoring lacks and the shortcomings in monitoring are part also of the problem. There, of course, not everything is done, and we could do more as a global community to restore better our landscapes. But there's already a lot of things being done, and part of the reason for which they're not seen is because we are lacking a common framework for examining them. And this is one of the things that came out very early in the decade, was the lack for a proper monitoring frame that could allow to transparently report on progress and to monitor those. Now, restoration itself is intrinsically difficult to monitor. We have now data, we have now means and tools to look at Earth on a very regular basis and look at the changes in Earth and the subtle changes, both negative ones, deforestation, degradation, or positive ones. But fundamentally, looking at something like restoration is more complicated than looking at losses. It's more complicated to look at progressive restoration of a landscape, which takes 15 to 20 years, than it is to look at clear cuts of tracts of forests for large-scale agriculture or infrastructures. I guess everybody understands that easily. But we start to have the data there, and it starts to get better. What is needed to do that is a very open and transparent way, and that's part of the monitoring solutions. So we have now the technology to do that. What is missing is really the framework to put all things together and to have things that are comparable. So in order to put together all the initiatives that are out there, we need to set up a framework for monitoring and a set of indicators that can be comparable across initiatives, across different actors. And that's what the Task Force for Monitoring has been focused on since the beginning. It includes now over 300 individuals that we regularly meet, 100 institutions from civil society, local NGOs, international NGOs, academia, research. And what the task force has been focusing on for the past 2 years, in short, is resolving the issues regarding transparency, resolving ambiguity on what we call a restoration success, and resolving the accessibility of those. So we have now like indicators that are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. The 20 headlines are there. We have the data that corresponds to that. This is going to be launched later this week, and it's a very good timing for us to be able to show that now. The task force itself is looking at all the ecosystems across, terrestrial, aquatic, and also the socio-economic component that have been underlined before. And we hope that now that we have that framework that's launched now, that's a concrete outcome, we will be in a better position to take into account all the little initiatives that may have gone under the radar. And yeah, of course, there's more to do, but at least that framework was definitely missing, and it's now a gap that's filled.
Just a quick follow-up there, Remy. Can you just tell us what are the main metrics that you're measuring or monitoring? Is it carbon content? Is it biodiversity? What are the data points that you need, and to what extent are they technologically available or not?
Yeah, again, good question. So basically, we have both biophysical and socioeconomic indicators that are within those. The amount of the indicators that we collected at the beginning of this work was tremendous. We had like across the different initiatives and institutions, we have over 700 different indicators. Some of them were overlapping, and some of them were just duplicated. And trimming that down, we now came with 20 headlines that are covering a lot of those aspects that you mentioned. So they're both biophysical. They look at carbon storage. They look at extent of change. They look at biodiversity. But they're also socioeconomic values. They are like opportunities for restoration, co-benefits associated, costs for implementing restoration activities. And this will be just a starting point. We will need to go into more detail into those, but those 20 indicators are really covering those different aspects, and yeah, they get combined. The data that comes with them get more and more available, but there's certainly work to be done, especially on aquatic and marine ecosystems, for instance. We're still very much lacking, but it's good progress being done. So I think we should also be somehow a little positive about those good progress that's being made.
I think correct me if I'm wrong, but under our bond commitment, we're supposed to be restoring at least 350 million hectares of degraded land. Is that kind of specificity where you're looking at opportunity costs, socioeconomic indicators, as well as that basic geophysical information that satellite monitoring can give us? Is it feasible to monitor with such complication and such specificity if our ambition is so enormous as it should be?
I think monitoring the ambition is not the crux point. I think one thing is important is that there are plenty of initiatives that are ongoing. Projects like the tree that Christophe mentioned are there, and they're not all the time taken into account because they've not been fitting into any of the reporting frameworks. So that's why I was saying it's part of the problem.
So you don't need to monitor and report on everywhere. You just need to have a framework that allows you to monitor wherever you need to.
Or that allows everybody to report and monitor on a common place. And this is part of the registry that will be also launched on Wednesday, part of the framework for ecosystem restoration. This is operational and functional now, and that will be a place that where all actors that are involved somehow in restoration activities can take part. And then, of course, you have global solutions to also monitor from top down. But for sure, if we want to reach the different commitments we have, the bond challenges and the 1 billion hectares restoration global commitment, we also need to take into account all small initiatives that are not necessarily seen from those fancy, what do we call them earlier?
Fancy schmancy.
Solutions. This is a mix of all of that.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Very good, thank you. Ugratna, I'm so embarrassed to have mangled your second name earlier. I've spent a large part of my life in India, and my children were born there. I've served myself very poorly. Ugratna, you're representing youth activism in this subject area. I just wonder if you could tell us, please, how significant that is and what you consider your mandate or your mission to be.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you also for having me here. And to talk a little bit about you, you heard me in the opening panel. I think that very much explained the importance of why engaging young people is significant. Specifically, if you look at the decade itself, the whole narrative of preventing, halting, and reversing the loss of ecosystem is central to it. I would like to, begin by a bit of controversial opinion, saying that restoration is, of course, at core of what the decade is about. But let's not forget that it does not replace conservation, which has to happen at first place. It's not, a green pass to destroy more forest with the narrative that, oh, we will, restore them eventually. So, just to put it out there, it is still something developed as a measure which is in addition to everything else that has to happen. Speaking about the youth engagement in decade particularly, young people have been involved. Of course, the movement, the youth movement has grown in climate space, starting from organizing to what we have seen in 2018 with more and more young people taking to streets to talk about their rights, to talk about their future. And it is in the same spirit that towards 2019, in March, I believe, the GA resolution was adopted, in which the decade was mandated, and subsequently the same year, just before the pandemic hit, youth all over the world had organized on-ground consultations in more than 22 countries to consult about what they want from the decade, and thereby getting a whole mandate to work on the decade for the rest 10 years in the strategy, which was then launched subsequently in, I believe, sometime early 2020. And that is how the evolution took place. And later down into the year, we had the mandate to establish the Youth Task Force, thereby bringing really youths in the core decision-making of the decade. It's a fairly new structure. Of course, not the youth movement, but the task force itself. It's been 4 months since it's been operationalized, so it's still in its nascent stage. Having said that, the youth inclusion has been a cross-cutting priority, as we have seen, whether those are different structures of the decade itself or the whole narrative itself of what needs to happen. I think Christoph talked about certain barriers. There are actually 7 barriers in total that were identified in the decade strategy, and I think one of the core barriers was about lack of awareness, lack of education, and then about essentially the lack of motivation, how you get local actors, how you get local governments, how you get city governments to act. So that is also somewhere the youth movement really holds power, both as a beneficiary, but then also as an enabler in order to act on the decade. That, essentially would be a little bit of summary into what it holistically means, and then what it means in terms of both being a change maker and beneficiary of this process.
Thanks very much indeed, Grant. I'll follow up with you too, if I may. In our the first panel, or the first section of this panel, we heard the word movement mentioned a lot. That this has to be a mass effort, which makes sense given the scale of ambition. I just wonder if you have any concrete ideas or suggestions for us on how you do that. Not in terms of institutional frameworks and committees and action plans, but actually in the real world. How do you get into the villages and local communities broadly and engage people behind this effort?
Yes, thank you. I would actually talk about both the things, the institutional frameworks and how grassroots communities are engaged in it. Allow me to begin by outlining the institutional framework of the decade and actually offering a perspective, because this community out here that is here, you all can directly get involved in the decade movement itself. And how is that possible? So the decade itself has what is called as the partners of the decade, and it is very easy to become a partner, whether you are a grassroots movement, whether you are a formal institution or recognized institution or a UN agency, of course. It is very much possible to join it. And right now, the decade is actually developing its action plan for the next, 8 years. So the whole title of this plenary was 8 years to heal the planet. And that is a space for you to directly feed into the action plan and concretizing what that means. So there are different open-ended questions which are actually in the action plan, which is about what it means for countries' NDCs. What does it mean for youth? What does it mean for local government? How do you actually concretize how the decade would be monitored or how it will be implemented? And And that is really an open space for everybody to get engaged. And I would really, urge everybody in the room, especially the stakeholders that are here, to become our partners and get engaged. Equally, if you look at the structure of the decade itself, I think I don't have to elaborate. There are experts here from the coordination group of the decade and the advisory board. I would like to call upon the member states that are here, the donors that are here, if you really want to invest in future of young people, invest in the multi-partner trust fund of the decade, MPTF. It is a trust fund established to help implementation of the decade, but also maintain the team that is implementing the decade, and also thereby indirectly supporting the youth. And it is extremely crucial that countries, that donors step up to contribute to this multi-partner trust fund that has to be replenished, and we cannot have another fund in the UN system existing where it is not replenished. Coming to your final sort of question, which you actually asked, was about how do you consult with the grassroots. So this comes down to the identity of what the major groups are. So you heard in the morning from IFSA, which actually is a major group model for the forestry process. Where we are coming from is more on the environment processes. And we essentially follow a universal membership. That means youth organizations, whether they are grassroots movement, whether they are informal groups, directly have participation rights to get involved in our processes and have a decision-making role, have voting rights and other participation rights, and thereby facilitating really a universal space of collaboration. Now, of course, do I go down in villages? Sometimes, yes. My organization, Plan for the Planet, is based in over 50, 60 countries, and we have, country chapters where young people are really working with the school children. But then equally, we have to make sure that we do not put the blame on the consumers. It is not up to the youth to go and, educate 100 schools. It is up to the governments. They are the ones that have to make the policy changes. And with them doing it, it is much more faster, much more efficient, rather than, putting the burden on the young people or putting the burden on just the community-based organization. It is the problem that has been created historically, and people that have to fix it, they know what needs to be done. It is a lack of political will. And of course, the whole hashtag Generation Restoration, it was launched last year. But what does it concretely mean? We talk about, that restoring restoring ecosystems would prevent, I believe, up to 30% of biodiversity loss already. It can already give you the 2030 mitigation targets. All of that is excellent. But we need it to be implemented. We need it to be concretized in the targets of the countries. And it has to be done. And it has to be done now. We don't want to convene in the next Forestry Congress and talk about 2 more years to heal the planet. Probably won't even have those 2 years. So really, putting down that urgency. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Ugratna. Gabrielle, climate is the overarching context for all of these discussions, but I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific for us in terms of the climate context of this restoration effort, but also the degree to which RED Plus or other tools to try to monetize climate finance behind landscape preservation, averted deforestation and degradation, and perhaps even restoration. What's the potential there for harnessing that 10-year-old, largely unsuccessful, although still very promising effort behind this initiative?
Thanks, James. I think that perhaps the most important publication of this year has been the IPCC report of the Working Group 3. It's a heavy reading. I think that the follow chapter, it's 185 pages. But there is a lot of data there. For the purposes of this meeting, I think that one of the most important data points is that the potential of ecosystem restoration below $100 a ton is about 2.2 gigatons in carbon removals. That requires, for example, that the bond challenge is fully implemented. That is 300 million hectares by 2030. That is about 40 million hectares per year. Every year we put into ecosystem restoration. For the purposes of comparison, that is about every year 4 times the area of South Korea. Every year between now and 2030. We're close that goal per year. And there are different opinions about why that's not the case, but I think that one of them is that we will find a business case to do ecosystem restoration for perhaps a few dozen million hectares. It is another thing to find the business case to put 350 million hectares in restoration by 2030. That's the difference between funding a couple of wind farms here and there and having the UK running on renewable energy for a full day, something that was achieved last year. There are several angles, I think, James, to tackle the problem of how we can monetize that. From where I come from, I would choose the one of ecosystem restoration has a number of benefits, social and ecological benefits. One of them, it is that it is the nature, actually. It is the only solution for the time being, for the next 10 to 15 years, to do carbon removals at scale. And I would say cheaply as well. Carbon capture and storage is something in its infancy. We will get nowhere near what we need in the next 10 to 15 years. You want to do carbon removals at scale, nature is the only game in town. The problem we have, as I said, is that, what is the business case to do that? And if you approach the problem from a mitigation angle, and if we take a look at lessons from other sectors, renewable energy, ecosystem restoration is lacking two things. And that's, one is a price that makes it attractive to invest in ecosystem restoration. And the second is certainty about demand for these carbon removals. Have a look at the energy sector, and these are two conditions that dominate the transition we see today. Again, it is an attractive price, or at least a price that will assure a positive return. And the second is certainty that you will be able to sell this product, in this case, renewable energy somewhere. Put that in the discussion of ecosystem restoration, and the translation is we need to have a forest carbon price for high-quality carbon removals. I'm not talking about hot air, but high-quality carbon removals that makes attractive ecosystem restoration. And the other thing is we need to give certainty that there will be buyers for these carbon removals. And if you talk about high-quality carbon, James, like something that could be compared to what you see in Europe in terms of the cost of the allowance, one wonders the cost for a bit less than half of the emissions in the EU. The cost of producing that emission, it was about $60 to $80 a ton. That is what it cost. Forest carbon at this moment is between 5 and 10. So until we bridge that difference, it's difficult to see how we make, at least from the mitigation angle, a solid business case for ecosystem restoration at scale.
And that $5 or $10 a ton is what you'll get on voluntary markets trading forest carbon credits?
That is what you could get in the voluntary markets. That is, if you have the means to report and monitor, what you could also get from donors.
When you say, Gabrielle, that there's a business case for restoring effectively a tiny minority of the enormous area that we talk of restoring, are you referring to the local economic rationale, or are you talking about the potential for climate finance flows, especially from wealthy countries?
It's a combination of both. There are low-hanging fruits, as in any sector, and that could be because there is donor funding plus important contributions from a number of factors. It can also be because you can combine ecosystem restoration with other productive activities that give you a premium. So yeah, you will see that, and that will carry you some way. It's unlikely that it will get you to the 350 million hectares between now and 2030.
And so if there is not a business case for restoring the majority, a large majority perhaps of the 350 million hectares that we've pledged to restore, what prospect is there?
The last couple of IPCC reports, if you trust them, if you believe them, they are really giving you the impression of a crisis, and that there is a need to act soon. Now, we have been doing a number of really very valuable things for the last 20 years. Really valuable, and we have learned a lot. But I think the scale of the challenge requires trying new things. Otherwise, it's very unlikely we will get to 2030 where we want to be.
Thank you. I do think it's important that we're all engaged in an optimistic effort. We need optimism to keep going when the scale of the challenge is so enormous, but it doesn't do any harm to be realistic when we set ourselves these enormous goals. Christophe, just to perhaps re-inject a bit of optimism into our discussion, how do you identify model ways of doing this restoration? How do you identify best practices? And how easy is it actually to spread those best practices?
Thank you, James. It's not an easy task to define what is a good restoration practice. And to clarify this question, the Task Force on Best Practices, in partnership with the Society for Ecological Restoration, with IUCN, CEM, and other key leading organizations active in our task force, we published last year a document with 10 principles to guide project practitioners or project implementers in the context of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. These principles are supposed to be applicable among all sectors, regions, biomes, and they state that a good or effective restoration intervention is contributing first to the global policy framework, the SDGs, the Rio Convention, is promoting a fair and inclusive engagement of all stakeholders, is including a continuum of restorative activities, is addressing the driver of degradation, is benefiting to nature and people, is incorporating all types of knowledge, including local and indigenous people knowledge, is trying to provide multiple benefits, both ecological, cultural, and socioeconomic, etc., etc. I encourage all participants to read the full document with the description of all the principles. Building on those principles, our task force is currently prepared with the same partners standard of practice to guide the restoration practitioner on how to use those principles during the implementation, the planning phase, the implementation phase, the monitoring phase of their restoration project. And those standards of practice should be available by the end of this year.
Christophe, thank you very much indeed. We are coming close to the end of this panel, and we have another ghost to summon up. This ghost is Tom Crowther, who is a professor at the Department of Environmental Systems Science at ETH Zurich. And Tom is going to give us some closing panelist remarks. If we could have his video, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction, James. Yeah, I'm actually here representing with a number of different hats on today to sort of summarize the closing remarks. And my main hat is that I'm the chair of the advisory board for the UN Decade. And for those of you who don't know about the advisory board, it's a diverse mixture of people with a diverse mixture of perspectives on this topic, ranging from Princess Basma, who we heard earlier, all the way to President Felipe Calderon, and a vast number of actors across this space. And so I'm here to both bring the perspective of that board and glean insights from this session that can be taken back to the board. And I think first I want to say I'm devastated that I couldn't be there in person, because it seems like it's been a fantastic session and there's so much more to learn in the process. But some of those insights that we've learned today have really aligned well with the goals of the board, which are along the lines of, we're understanding the immense scale of this challenge, the immense difficulty of this challenge, and the immense work that we all have to do to move towards it. And also the challenge that, the potential impact for climate is huge, but this is so much more than a climate challenge. This is a challenge for food insecurity, water insecurity, address water insecurity. It's for human well-being across the globe. It's for essentially climate and environmental equity across the planet. And that is the foundations of what the UN Decade is all about. I think I'll start by mentioning that ultimately what we need, as has been mentioned multiple times, is a systems level change. It's a systems level change to represent the values of biodiversity, not just for the climate movement, but also for the thousands of services that nature provides for human well-being across the globe. And to do that, we need to focus on that bottom-up movement. That is the message that everybody was replicating. The movement needs to be a bottom-up one, empowered by the local communities and the biodiversity that they depend directly on. And so we need to find those economic and ecological systems changes that can facilitate that effort. At the large scale, or the high level, the UN Decade is progressing at pace with 153 flagship projects that have been sort of proposed by over 70 government, over 76 governments across the globe. These are incredibly inspiring indications and examples of how restoration can be implemented at scale. And there's already been 10 of the first 30 that have been selected so far. There's been over 61 countries represented across all of those major ecosystem initiatives. And until now, the Multi-Partner Trust Fund is moving rapidly towards its goal of raising $100 million to mobilize to facilitate this bottom-up restoration movement. I'm here representing the board in my role as a scientist. It was a few years ago we conducted some of the research to show that there is globally this potential, enormous potential of nature, with almost 100 billion hectares of land available for forest regeneration, 0.9 billion hectares that if we could protect those ecosystems in the long run, could capture up to 30% of the excess carbon that's sitting in the atmosphere today. But clearly this is an immense challenge that goes far, far beyond climate. It's about the soil integrity, the biodiversity that underpins all the ecosystem services that we require for human well-being across the globe. And my other role is representing a key partner for the UN Decade. This partner is working closely with the UN Task Force and the Science Monitoring Task Force and the Science Task Force to sort of bring transparency across the hundreds of thousands of initiatives that are happening across the globe. This project is called Restore, and it's sort of like a Google Maps for restoration, aligning with the UN Decade to represent all of those thousands of partners across the globe, showing that currently there's around 120,000 local initiatives across the globe that you can now go online and you can see every one of those initiatives. You can see the trees and the plants changing over time. You can understand how the ecology and the social dynamics are changing in response to those efforts. And the key goal there is bringing transparency to this movement so that we can facilitate connectivity. Connections are ultimately what is going to make this movement a sustainable one, bringing together the learnings of experts, the local projects and the local community leaders across the globe, the indigenous leaders, the women, the women-led communities that are bringing back such valuable insights that are necessary for a sustainable future. And by bridging those connections across those thousands of initiatives, we're accelerating the learning process. And in addition, it's bringing the connectivity to us, the rest of us, who can facilitate that movement with volunteering, donating, and investing in their sustainably sourced products. Ultimately, it's this connectivity that underpins the UN Decade. And it's this massive scale of connectivity that gives us the potential to start making those valuable steps towards a successful UN Decade. Again, we need massive ecological and economic systems transformations that are ultimately going to underpin a bottom-up restoration movement driven by the local communities across the globe and the biodiversity that they depend on. Together, we all have to build all of our actions towards this single unified goal. Thanks very much.
And thank you, Tom. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings this panel to a close. I found it extremely interesting, quite sobering. I think that we've done well to sort of reflect on the enormity of the challenge that we face, and actually the ambition that this UN Decade has to meet that challenge. There's no want of ambition, and there's no want of recognition of the scale of the challenge. The goal of restoring 350 million hectares is almost audacious. On the plus side, I think we've got a clear sense of what progress depends upon. It depends upon involving the whole gamut of institutional actors, government, multilaterals, civil society, and then local people at the heart of it, and listening to local people, learning from local people where they have knowledge of their local environment that those institutions need to take note of. But again, we've heard, I think, some sobering notes on how little progress, frankly, is being made set against the enormity of that challenge, of the ambition that we have. We've certainly heard some inspiring stories of progress. I particularly enjoyed hearing Princess Basma's presentation on the biodiversity corridor, the enormous biodiversity corridor in Brazil. But still, the progress is insufficient so far. The 100 million that we're still looking for to fill that UN Trust Fund is the price of a decent goal-scoring European footballer. And if we can't find that, frankly, we're in trouble. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists here, Christophe, Remy, Ugratna, and Gabrielle. And thank you all.